In today's event, in Elvin's publicity letter, the SASW mentioned that this keynote topic, practice research in social work to what end, it's put forth with the aim to promote confidence and competence in our practitioners. My question really is practice-based research a necessary step to evidence-based practice? So to respond to this question this morning, I'm going to try to answer a series of questions. First of all, what is evidence-based practice? What are the arguments for and against evidence-based practice in social work? What are the alternatives? Is evidence-based practice better or practice-based evidence better? Okay, and what exactly is practice research? Now, social work has long been troubled by the adequacy of its claim to professional standards and about its possession of appropriate level of knowledge and expertise. People say social workers, they are not scientific, right? So many social workers and researchers and practitioners then responded to this inadequacy by joining the so-called evidence-based bandwagon. So people have gone on to evidence-based practice because they want to prove. Social work, like psychologists, for example, have been embarked in evidence-based practice in order to prove its profession to be a science. And we realize that there could be problems if social workers do that without realizing some of the pertinent issues, which I'm going to highlight this morning for all of us to continue and to begin thinking if you are not already doing so. And as early as in the 1970s, right, 1978, Brian Sheldon articulated the relationship between theory and practice, right, in social work that was inconsistent and muddled. And he said we actually need to draw, social workers need to draw from the essential principles of science, particularly the biomedical science, to improve the horrendous situation in social work. That was in 1978, when Sheldon actually started saying, let's go for the technological rationality. Okay, that's a term that you may want to remember in social work. That's where we actually started talking about evidence-based social work. Okay, so what is evidence-based social work about, basically? And then it was in the turn of this century, all right, in the 2002, 2003, evidence-based social work picked up momentum. If you have not heard of Gambrill, you want to be able to remember Gambrill, G-A-M-B-R-I-L-L. She started putting in by referring to a lot of the medical principles in doing practice, evidence-based practice in social work. Right? So what exactly is evidence-based social work? Okay? Now, it's very much borrowed from the medical field. So let's look at the origin of evidence-based social work. And much of what social work does in evidence-based is also borrowed from the medical field. And the person in the medical field would be Sackett, right? As in S-A-C-K-E-T-T, right? Who first defined evidence-based practice, right, in the medical field as the conscientious, explicit, right, and judicious use of current best practice. Best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. Now note the highlighted words here: conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence. Then you may want to ask, what do you mean by evidence? There is another very important word which I'm not going to go into, and that's fundamental to the word evidence, and that is epistemology, paradigm, worldview. In the world of research, you must know what is your paradigm. Are you on a positivistic paradigm, or are you in a postmodern paradigm? Without understanding positivism, without understanding post-positivism, without understanding postmodernism, which I'm sure many of you are using. For example, how many of you have heard of solution focus? How many of you are already using it? How many of you are hearing narrative therapy? How many of you are using narrative therapy? Now, what is the paradigm of solution focus and narrative therapy? Anyone shouting it out for me? Postmodern, right? How many of you use structural family therapy? Okay, one. What do the rest use? Cognitive behavioral therapy. What is the paradigm of cognitive behavioral therapy? Now, there are a lot of very fundamental values in each and every of these models. That's what I mean by paradigm or the epistemological position. And when we embark either on our practice, even not going into research, we must ask ourselves, can I combine CBT with solution focus? I will tell you a story about, is Irene here? Irene Yong, Miss Irene Yong. Yeah, she's a dear friend of mine. One day we were seeing a case together with an audience at the back. She was using solution focus, I was using structural family therapy, and we almost fought in the room. The case was there, and it's a case of a juvenile, and then she was asking, the mother has divorced 5 years ago, and mother and daughter had a horrible relationship. So I said, oh mom, I think you have a horrible problem with your daughter. You have communication issues here. Then Irene jumped in and said, wow, mom, you are fantastic. You are able to bring this family together even though, it's so hard. I said, no, mom, I think you have a problem here. And we went on for a while, and I realized I better zip my mouth before we confuse our clients. My point is trying to illustrate to you, even in practice, when you are not clear about where you are getting at in terms of your worldview and your belief, and therefore you will be in confusion. What more if you are going to embark on a piece of research, you ought to know what kind of evidence that you are going to generate. It is important that you begin to think about that, but we don't have time. But it's a very important issue that I can never describe the process of evidence-based practice, right? To be something like the practitioner, all right, when presented with a case, has to formulate an answerable clinical question. Next, they need to do a search on the relevant empirical findings and meta-analyses and critically appraise the research that is found for that particular case. And this critical evaluation should be done in terms of impact, validity, and relevance to the case at hand. Now, there is so much that is packed into this very simple, apparently, definition. Like, for example, what is validity? And are you able to tell the difference between validity and reliability? I would strongly encourage the ministry and CSS, our association, to embark on workshops that would sort of sort out all these very basic issues for workers who are interested in embarking on basic research, practice research, etc. Okay? So this is a medical way of looking at things, and social workers also took on, and there are actually 5 different steps, right, to EBP, evidence-based practice. Now, what are they? Step number 1 basically is to convert practice information needs into answerable questions like in all good science. And the kinds of questions would be to do with effectiveness, prevention, assessment, description, prediction, harm of that particular treatment. Okay? Step number 2, okay, it's to do with, and also cost and benefits. And then step number 2 is to track down with maximum efficiency the best evidence with which to answer the question, right? So what is the most effective way? What is the best evidence that we will be able to answer those questions to do with cost, benefit, to do with harm, prediction, description, etc.? And how then do we track down? What do we track down? We track down by looking into books, journals, systematic reviews, organized by client, problem, or treatment approach, right? Published lists of effective programs by federal governments, bodies, research centers, etc. Practice guidelines, right? Manuals that have been validated to treat a certain problem, right? And there are even I think, very useful databases that I think social science have also started using. That means bad practices. Don't do it. If you do it, it will be problematic. We definitely need a pool of knowledge like that. So there is the Cochrane collaboration, there is the Campbell collaboration, and these are the efforts in the science, and then later on in social sciences, where people gather all this very useful information. And I hope one day our association, for example, would have that depository telling people, don't do this because it's unethical. Don't do that because it will bring no good to the clients. And I think as we embark on thinking about doing good practice research, we should be able to gather that kind of body and even share it internationally with a specific problem in a specific setting for a specific community. That I think would be a vision that we could have one day. Right? And what's the next step? The next step is step 3, and then it's critically appraising the research evidence for its validity and usefulness. So you go into the database, you look at treatment manuals and guidelines, etc. And then you want to be critically appraising it. Then comes the next step, which applies these results of appraisal to practice. Not just practice, but policy, decision makings, and etc. Now, much of this is also in psychology. For example, in 2006, they had a very big discussion, and so did family therapy. Then talk about the client values, then talk about culture, then talk about other variables that cannot be so rigidly structured, and so it became a bit more dynamic. Now, some social workers, right, step 4, and some social workers and consider evidence-based practice as a new and revolutionary practice approach that holds great promise for building stronger bridges between science and social work. And here I would like to highlight the word again. What is science? And we are in the social science. So is social science science? Is it scientific? Right? These are all very important philosophical questions that we need to answer. Another term would be empirical. What is empirical data? What makes empirical data? Has it got to be RCT, randomized controlled trials that are done by the doctors? Then would that be considered empirical? These are all the questions that I think social workers need to begin to think when they start doing what they call EBP. Evidence-based practice, right? So many of these social workers think that it's a requirement for social workers to do evidence-based practice in order to be good social work practice. For example, we have Roberts and Eagle in 2006 who said this, right? That social workers have always been concerned with improving the quality of life and restoring psychosocial and family functioning for all clients, and in some cases, even saving lives. And because we have such important functions to carry, it is imperative for social workers to be prepared with the latest evidence-based practice protocols and research exemplars. We owe it to our clients and the social work profession to only use interventions that have systematic evidence of their effectiveness and efficacy. And so these are the supporters and promoters and advocates for evidence-based practice in social work with a very clear mission. Why do we do it? We do it because we owe it to our clients to deliver the best we know. Social workers, when defining evidence-based practice, however, have also differed from the other professions by emphasizing 3 other components given the broad scope of the kind of work that we do. For example, our traditional theoretical emphasis of PIE, person in an environment, and our promulgation of values such as respect of self-determination and individuality, and the promotion of social justice, which is in part of the definition of what social work is. The moment we get into all of these 3 very important areas, the medical, the scientists would come and challenge us. So what is the kind of evidence can you produce in doing EBP? all right, evidence-based practice, because it then will take it onto a very different track. So these above components pose challenges for us to be able to rationally and technically apply evidence in the strictest sense in the medical field for social work. So in fact, the founders of evidence-based practice and their most ardent supporters in evidence-based practice, even in the medical field, acknowledge that evidence to be integrated with expertise of the worker and the values and the circumstances of the client. So we acknowledge, and even the classic, right, evidence-based practice advocates would tell you it is actually quite difficult to just do evidence-based practice without taking into consideration the very dynamic components involved in client, culture, worker-client relationship, even though they try to control as much as possible. Evidence-based practice, on the other hand, is not without controversies. Not just for social work, for science, for psychology, and I would like to elaborate the case that is against evidence-based practice, especially in social work. A major controversy relates to the perception that evidence-based practice is akin, is just like asking practitioners to be enslaved to the pursuit of an application of evidence that is very narrowly defined as randomized controlled trials, right? The next problem with evidence-based practice is that there are additional concerns that research evidence is incomplete. However you try to get evidence, whatever evidence you have are usually incomplete, misleading, biased, and detrimental to highly individualized practice. That means it's very difficult to tweak our individual treatment with a particular client. So a frequently voiced criticism of evidence-based practice is that there is little relevant research available regarding most questions that social workers deal with today. Do we have evidence today for what we do? It's very hard, especially on a case-by-case basis. So what I learned, having worked in the field for almost 2 decades now, is that there are always the generous. Like Minichi, Salvador, my supervisor would say, all families are the same. So there are general principles, right? All poor families are the same. All women are the same. All men are the same. So there are generous. There are the general principles that we can learn about. But then he continued to say, all families are different. All women are different. All men are different. So it is with this kind of an understanding that everything is the same, so we can learn the generous, but we also must remember everything else, everyone else is different. And it is with this kind of an outlook that I sometimes worry that we blindly just apply evidence-based practice by following a certain evidence without question. Okay, so let's move on to look at some of these problems that people raise about evidence-based practice. Social workers and professionals and those in counseling and therapy and psychology who emphasize the uniqueness of our clients also reject the medical metaphor of a prescriptive approach to working with people. For example, using DSM-4, how we actually use those guidelines that sometimes would actually jeopardize the welfare of our clients. We in social work are always cautious of that. So when you turn on the evidence-based practice channel, you may forget some of these cautions that social workers are always talking about. Now, furthermore, there are also contention and debates, right, in social work for the longest time, for decades, about the connection between theory and practice. Now, particularly debates to do with the possibility of straightforward application of abstract knowledge that we pull from psychology, that we pull from sociology, that we pull from the medical science, etc. All right? It's difficult to apply these so easily, so mindlessly to everyday problem. The debate is about the power of relationships. When we equip ourselves with all of these evidence, what do we then become? we become experts. We know that we have the evidence. We know we have the backing. And what does it mean and what does it do to your relationship with your client? You need to think about that. Are we then expert and so expert that we forget about the collaboration and listening to the voices of our clients, right? And then there is debate about the tension between relationship between social workers and the people they serve, which I've highlighted. We need to consider carefully that social work deals with decision tasks that concern the social rather than the physical. So when we borrow an idea like evidence-based practice from the medical world, when they look into our heart, our limbs, that's really the physical science. It is different from the social reality that consists of people attaching meaning to their own and others' behavior. Now, the basic elements that are needed to answer a clinical question or perform a decision analysis are not really out there for social workers because each client is different. Each situation varies. So we need to be very careful, and thus the situations that we get into can then be very subjective, can be very relative, and can be very debatable. So when we apply what we call evidence-based practice, we then need to be very careful. Now, there is another issue in social work in relation to evidence-based practice, and that's the dual mandate of social work. Meaning, on one hand, all right, we are helping to emancipate, in other words, help people to be free of oppression, free of abuse. But on the other hand, social workers are also social control agents. We work with the government, and we don't work with the government on some issues. We work with our clients, right? So whose idea is that? Whose evidence? And what this evidence is for? Is it more for the authority, or is it more for the client? For example, I work in the earthquake situation for the past 5 years. There are mothers and parents who have lost their children marching to the office of the government. Now, we are trapped then. The government will produce evidence to tell you they are doing the wrong thing, and would ask you to stop, for example, these clients who are marching to the offices of the government. So as a social worker, there are many issues to deal with. So who is right? Right? So this is the dual mandate of social workers that would actually bring issues when we think about evidence-based practice. So in other words, I'm actually complicating the issue here, and that's my job. To tell you, good, let's think about evidence-based practice, but don't do it without thinking through some of these pertinent issues. Now, since evidence-based practice can be problematic, do we have other way out? Yes, we do. But am I saying that evidence-based practice is no good? No, that's not my point. Let's look at the alternative, right? Now, Jordan, in 1978, argued that social work practice is influenced by more complex and remote forces than a precise scientific knowledge for use like evidence-based practice. And it is important that social workers understand some of these forces out there, very complicated dynamic forces that cannot be answered by a piece of evidence. All right, if we are to work effectively, Jordan concluded that, of course, it is important for social work to try to evolve precise, testable theories, but it is also important that it remains open to real moral, social, and political dilemmas. Recently, I have learned another word, more than dilemma, what is that? Trilemma. It's true, there is such a word called trilemma. And you search the word trilemma, I think sometimes social workers get into trilemma situations where only one of the three or only two of the three can work, and then it clashes. So it becomes a very complicated situation for us to always want to be able to work with our clients, right? So along with Jordan Parton, all right, in 2000 added that uncertainty, confusion, and doubt. I repeat, uncertainty, confusion, and doubt are key elements in characterizing the nature of social work. In other words, we are always dealing with uncertainty, confusion, and doubt, which is the hallmark of social work. One of the reasons why I like to be a social worker is because it's messy. And this messy, deal with the marriage that is breaking down, the abuse that has been involved. It's so dynamic. It keeps me on my toes and tells me that, Tim, we don't know enough. We don't know enough. It's way too messy. It's way too uncertain. It's way too difficult for us to be able to comprehend. And there are a lot of moral issues and political issues and social issues involving individual, family, community, and even national. To provide answers for you, I hope you will bring all your questions with you and continue to think about whether social work is an art or a science, or both an art and science. I always say, like ballerina, you know, we go tap, 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 pirouette, jump, jump, jump. It sounds very technical, but you know the person who does pirouette this way and another person who does pirouette another way, they need to have the technical training. But when they perform on stage, it becomes an art. So if I may use that as an analogy, there are things that we need to train. Don't tell me abstract art is easy. You try doing something and you can call it abstract art. Abstract art has a lot of training that needs to go into it. And then whatever that you don't understand is because you may not have enough, right, understanding or technical training. So the higher form, in that sense, requires a lot of basics, a lot of training that will go into it. So I see social work as something that is so complex, that cannot be teased out so conveniently and easily, because we are dealing with lives. We are dealing with people. We are dealing with people in interaction with environment. People in environment, right? So reflections enables, all right, hopefully, right, this is the slide, enables practitioners to tap into knowledge gained through experiences, and therefore it's not about the scientific evidence-based practice. It is about the kind of knowledge that we can accumulate through reflections. Right? The practitioner gains a deeper understanding of the meaning of the experience by bringing to consciousness tacit knowledge. And this word is to be highlighted, and I didn't. Right? There are a lot of tacit knowledge in social work that needs to be accumulated as we grow older, as we practice more, and that again is the charm of social work. It comes with experience, right? And many of us here are very young. I'll use the word very green. And you know what? The attraction of social work is the more you do it, the more you would be even more mature, you will be even more handsome, you'll be even more pretty when you continue practicing social work, because it enriches us, makes our lives and the clients' lives more beautiful. Right? So on a practical note, Legarten suggested that instead of developing practice guidelines, accumulating databases, a focus should be based on developing individual workers' decision-making in such a way that corresponds to the ways in which experts take decisions in real-life settings. In other words, development of expertise of social workers should be stimulated with both social work education and social work practice. So in other words, our universities, now we have more and more social work programs, should also be helping to build the capacity, the expertise of our workers in a real-life situation. This leads us to another topic, right? Because of time, I'm not going to elaborate more about that very important tacit knowledge that we have just started talking about. So here you have evidence-based practice and the case for it and the case against it because of the dynamic nature of social work. Then, in family therapy as well, the word evidence-based practice is broken up, turned around, and called practice-based evidence. It's different from the scientific kind of a tradition. You turn practice as the focus. So there are two words here to sum up. The evidence-based practice talked about what works with an S. So you go for what works, all right? Then a lot of menus now on what works for adolescents, what works for children, and these are all the compilation of evidence-based practices in different arenas. You turn the word practice-based evidence then would be focusing on what worked with an ED. I was so happy to see some of the practice-based evidence out there, and I encourage you to take a look at some of those. And many of those I would consider as practice-based evidence. Our social workers conscientiously, systematically compile what they have done, right, with their clients, and then they share their knowledge. It could be a small sample. It could be a very large sample based on all your case note. But these are all naturalistic studies. These are not clinical setting experimental studies. These are data that deals with real life situations. And so practice-based evidence then focuses on what you have done. Of course, many of them would be based on some theoretical models, some evidence that you get, but they were cautiously, carefully documenting what they do. Priya is here with us today, and Priya and Tony and Winnie from Feiyue. We did so-called a practice research together with the support of SASW. We were given a sum of money, $4,000, that was enough for us to do this project. We went into prisons with prisons permission and collaboration, and we worked with only 3 cases over 2 years. And then we compiled our work, and then we worked out a model. How do you engage the client and the family? How do you assess with the client, with the family, and what kind of interventions work? We struggled so much, but I can still not forget those good times we had together when we went into prison and we looked into the CMF, I can't even remember what is CMF now, but I remember CMF model, and we used those questions and we add on ours, we tried to tweak and, value added to it, we hoped. We learned so much from working over 3 cases. We sat down and systematically documented it, and there are 3 articles being published, and we had gone to several conferences. Priya even went to Shanghai, I remember, to talk about what did we do. Not only what we did well, but what didn't go well. And these are all awfully important lessons that we can learn from our practice. So this is the other way. Evidence-based practice is a way. The other way is practice-based evidence. So this is a new paradigm that draws from unselected, not randomized controlled trials. So these samples can be big or small, and they can include they can include surveys of clients and practitioners. For example, I was just working out with Touch Community Services, their cyber wellness program, and I had a great time interviewing the clients who have gone through TCS. And I learned so much from them that having been on a very, very big project on video game, just because I visited only 12 families, I turned around and said, the evidence we accumulated in the past 5 years, and we spent millions of Singapore dollars on it, and I think we are quite incomplete. By just visiting this client, I learned so much more. The fundamental of my hypothesis was totally challenged after I met them. Just 12 cases vis-a-vis 5 years of rigorous scientific processes. So we need both in that sense, all right? It could be studies of the impact of general processes in treatment that transcend orientation. It's not just about CBT or structural or narrative or solution focus. You must have heard of the recent common factors of change. Yeah? 4 factors to do with extra therapeutic. In other words, 40% of what we do or the client's change has nothing to do with the workers. It's all about their environment. 30% is about, for example, client-worker relationship, and that's 70%. Where is the place for model? Yes, maybe 15%. And you know what other 15%? Placebo, hope. So this is a very important finding in the recent times that is used as a very important guideline for us not to have to emphasize a specific model that works, which basically evidence-based practice advocates for, right? And so it could be effectiveness research that examines the impact of a typical treatment on a specific client populations. We have some of them out there in the foyer. All right, progress research in which client gains are regularly tracked during the treatment. For example, the touch community service project that we did. It was so exciting. It was so illuminating as far as our research goes. All right, and Dr. Chu Hik-kyung, some of you may know in NUS. Now we are trying to recruit doing clinical trial. It's very hard. We were talking about our project yesterday. After 8 months, we have 8 people that we got recruited because we were very rigorous, right? We want to have all sorts of criteria plus informed consent. It's very hard work. If you are going to do something properly, usually it takes a lot more work. So I would like to just rub this in. People who are in the management, associations, government, ministries, need to support social workers in their endeavors to do reviews, evaluation, or practice research, without which social workers will burn out. Already we have a very heavy caseload. So I'm not trying to push you to doing this without the support, all right? But you must be able to fight for the kind of support that you have, and support to be able to do this properly. So don't look to NUS, they are overstretched, right? You have to look elsewhere, Sim, right? NCSS. In fact, I understand that then NCYS, which is called the new ministry, right? And I think it was just after the millennium, I think it was 2002 to 03, they even have a workbook on how to conduct research. It's a nice handbook that I keep as a reference for teaching. Right? So there is a lot of work that has already gone on. So this is not totally new that I'm talking about in the field of social work. NCSS too has a research department, I think, that has been revamped recently. So look to all of these as resources for you, right? So typically the practice, right, with complex cases where practitioners' competence may be more important than intervention adherence. The word is fidelity. In evidence-based practice, right? You need to be fiddle. In other words, you follow a certain model and you do nothing else. So they train you to think and act as if you are a machine or instrument. But in social work, I'm sorry, that's not going to work very well if you are always so fiddle. In other words, flirt around, right? Flirt around with different approaches. Think about the options you have, all right? There are people who would come with different convictions, different beliefs. So I hope our field will be quarreling. Our field will be debating. Our field will be diverse. Not all will be doing evidence-based practice. There should be people doing evidence-based practice, but there should be people who are against it and say, no, we shouldn't be doing it, right? So that we will be having a check and balance. So my vision for social work, if we are going to embark on research, it would be a field, a social field that is diverse, that is different, and that is dynamic. If I may pose a vision for our field as we think about the vision ahead, all right? So, so typically the practice with complex cases, right, is more than just going according to fidelity. The practitioners come out of the planning shadows and is a stakeholder in the form of service and its delivery. In other words, we get involved, we get our hands dirtied, right? Lecturers, professors in the university ought to also jump in and do it where possible, right? And I believe as a social work academic, I cannot be teaching in the ivory tower. I will not be able to teach well if I am not practicing. So that's my encouragement and challenge to our colleagues in the university, that we must be connected to the field and, very importantly, doing the practice ourselves. Right? Routine monitoring of outcome is an essential component with the performance feedback to the practitioners and the service as a whole. This facilitates quality management by charting the expected and actual cost of clients in the service with various conditions. Now, benchmarks allow one service to compare and review outcomes with other similar services. So I can be doing it with touch, but at the same time, I would compare it with another FSC that may have a similar program. So reliable, relevant, sensitive psychometric systems, right? Which I have seen a lot of us using out there doing some quantitative studies. You use psychometric instruments, very good. But my question is, are they validated? In other words, are they relevant to our context here, right? Now, in Hong Kong, we have a lot of social work academics doing psychometrics. We need those. So even for a start, I think we need to have more psychometrics that would be sensitive to our Malay community, our Chinese community, our Indian community. We can't just pluck them from America, from England, and then use them here in Singapore. I don't think it's wise. We can't even take it from Hong Kong, or can't even take it from China conveniently. We need to get those in place, right? So, let us do a small survey now, as I have presented two, right, types of research for you. One is evidence-based practice. The other one is practice-based research or evidence. How many of you would be interested in evidence-based practice, EBP? One. Oh no, it was a mistake. She was just doing this. Anyone? Oh dear, I only have 10 minutes. One. How many of you would be interested in practice-based research? There seem to be more. Okay? Then my encouragement is I hope more would be interested in doing evidence-based practice. I'm only halfway through and I have 10 minutes. Okay. Now, my point is, right, basically that I think we need different kinds of evidence and different kind of knowledge. And let me quote a famous Sichuan adage that says, it doesn't matter what it is, right? A black cat or a white cat. As long as a cat catches the mice, it is a good cat. Evidence-based practice or practice-based evidence, right? Now, I would like to move on in probably concluding and not talk about my own practice research evidence, right? That there is what we call evidence, what we call practice research. So practice research basically is being able to do both evidence-based practice and practice-based research. Now I would like to comment based on what I've seen early this morning. Now we always talk about outcome studies. I've seen a lot of people trying to do outcome studies, but there is another very important practice research that is called process research. You may want to also think about process research. For example, how do I do empathy? What are the steps to doing empathy? It's not so much about looking at the effectiveness of your study. That is also very important. Allow me to, it's just the academic problem I have. Don't use the word methodology. You are really using methods. So all of that out there is wrong when you use the word methodology. Methodology includes epistemology and philosophy of your whole idea of design. People use methodology, and method is a part of your methodology, right? So what you are talking about is more methods out there on your posters. So beware of terms like that. So what is practice research? I was very privileged to be a part of a team in 2008 in Salisbury, UK, and I was the only Asian practitioner other than Jen Folk. And people from Europe, from America, we came together and we started asking, what is practice research? And we put together a statement, an international statement, and there is a link there. So practice research involves curiosity about practice. It is about identifying good and promising ways in which to help people, and it is about challenging troubling practice through the critical examination of practice and the development of new ideas in the light of experience in practice. It recognizes that this is best done by practitioners in partnership with researchers, and if I may add, our clients as well. Okay? Where the latter have as much, if not more, to learn from one another. It is an inclusive approach, and if I may stress again, including our clients, to professional knowledge that is concerned with understanding the complexity of practice alongside the commitment to empowerment and to realize social justice through practice. This is a statement where an international group of social workers came together to talk about what practice research is about, right? Now, practice research therefore involves the generation of knowledge of direct relevance to professional practice, and therefore will normally involve knowledge generated directly from practice itself in a grounded way. Now, in developing the relationship, right, it is between practice and research, there are very important principles: collaboration, participation, ethical reflexivity, and critical reflection, contextualizing what we do, and the dynamic, fluid, and or relational nature of the research that is very peculiar to social work. Now, how is it done? Right? New ways are being advocated. Evidence-based practice definitely is one way to go, but that's not the only way. So we need to be able to integrate new thinking into what we do, right? And what are the new ways? I see some of the posters out there and I'm very impressed that they have been able to use some of the new approaches that they came up with themselves after a discussion. So I strongly encourage you to look at some of the examples out there. Now, there needs to be a dynamic, all right, dialogue between practice and research, and methods for devising research problems and questions directly from practice, and the relative roles of practitioners and researchers require further attention. How does each of these different parties in the research process, that includes the practitioners, academics, service users, policies makers, management, right, making a different or similar contribution, all right, based on their expertise? Right, so there is a lot of dialoguing. I think the answer is getting the act together, right? I have the privilege, right, of spearheading different practice research projects in Singapore and in Hong Kong and in China. I've spent 5 years now working in Sichuan after the earthquake, and I'm very happy that we have been able to put together practice research projects. I'm not going to show all the rest of the slides because I don't have time. Or do I have time, organizer, for a bit more time? Is it possible? Who do I ask? Just Sujita, do I have a bit more time? 5 more minutes. Okay, then I won't go through the slides. But in a nutshell, I'm very privileged as a social work academic and a social worker practitioner. I've been practicing for a good 10 years before I went to academia. I consider myself a practitioner, and in the past 5 years, I've started embracing and becoming clearer about who I am. I don't tell people I'm a family therapist anymore. I tell people I'm a social worker. I used to be quite confused, basically, because I think it's sexier to be called a family therapist. But more and more I realize, coming back to my roots, I believe more and more about what social work can bring to the world and to individual lives. Having worked and seen how people are so dynamic, people who have suffered losses in an earthquake, including only spouse dying and only child dying, losing everything, and being able to stand up. And I asked myself, do I know anything to be able to help them? My answer is clearly no. What can I do? Very little. It humbles me a lot to be working with people and then not being an expert, not being a power figure, and to be able to work things out with them. And it's amazing. I don't have time to show you some of the slides and some of the gains that we have, but basically, in a nutshell, can you skip all of these all the way to the end, I believe. All right? These are my team, and these are some of the cases that we work with, and these are approaches that we have not used, and we went through from the tents all the way into the temporary housing, into the potter cabins. Can you hold that? Now, basically, we have done a lot of publicity about what we have done, and there are video clips that I'm not able to show today. Basically, you know, my workers who are just 3 years, 4 years, 5 years into the field after graduation, they are publishing their reports based on their experience. At the end of this year, we are going to have a symposium. We are going to get the government people in. We're going to get the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Civil Affairs, and I'm going to get Lina Dominelli from the UK, David Gillespie from USA to have a dialogue, so that based on the work that we do, we want to have an impact on prevention, risk reduction, especially when working in schools with children. So these are all based on the work that we do. They are no clinical trials. These are all real-life stories that we are able to convincingly tell the government, look, social work can make a difference. Social work can contribute to disaster management. Social work can help people who have suffered great losses. So I think this is the wrap-up I have when doing practice research, using the quantitative, using the qualitative, using evidence-based model, using practice-based evidence. It has been a powerful process for us because we are able to make changes even in socio-political context, which I also have the experience of doing it in Singapore, in our correctional system. Arnold was there when we had the workshop with the director of prisons and NCYS, NCSS, the mayor's representatives, CDCs. We were able to share with them some of the systems that our clients tell us that was actually a risk more than a protective factor. It's very rewarding because I'm able to learn so much from the stakeholders, especially our clients. And it can be very original when we think out of the box. And it's fun and terribly fulfilling, especially for the opportunities to work with young, dynamic social workers. For an older person like me, I think it's so inspiring to learn also from our younger workers, their dedication and their commitment, which I'm sure many of us are here in this room who are young and committed to this profession.